For the better part of a decade, buying a ticket to a Marvel movie felt like a cultural movement turned mandatory procedure. Everyone and their mum was interested to some degree, and it was difficult to suggest that they were unjust for that. But as things developed and it became clearer that the admittance into a Marvel movie came with the expository dump of a 5-year roadmap, things began to turn a little stale for this franchise. We lost character arcs for an overindulgence of post-credit scenes that just don't go anywhere. Emotional payoffs that felt earned were replaced by multiversal cameos around every corner, and every scene became plagued with this weightless CGI look that douses everything in an ugly, unappealing visual. Only a few years before, this cinematic universe had once been the undisputed crowning achievement of modern blockbuster filmmaking, and it began to lose that at an aggressive rate. When something you love begins to feel like it's giving you nothing but homework in the form of mostly lackluster or forgettable TV shows, how the hell do you even begin to keep yourself motivated enough to watch it all? When Thunderbolts was announced, it seemed to be Marvel's late response to James Gunn and his Suicide Squad project over at DC. It had a lot of the same vibes in the early looks at the roster and other varying factors, and when you look at it on paper, it had absolutely every reason to be yet another casualty in Marvel's increasingly concerning miss rate. Most of these characters haven't had much depth, with the only real exception to that being Bucky Barnes. 3 of these characters were introduced in Black Widow, 1 in Ant-Man and the Wasp, and 1 of them in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And glossing over the fact that some of these people admittedly are the standout aspects of their projects, it's still a roster that largely feels uninspired and dull. Everything about Thunderbolts on paper screams that it's some sort of filler episode that's meant to tide us over to the next big thing. However, Thunderbolts primarily understands its existence within the grand scheme of things. In fact, I'd say it pulls off a miracle for Marvel purely because it sticks to the fundamentals and the importance of execution over expansion. This isn't a story that concerns itself with the larger multiversal issue that the MCU has going on. It's a surprisingly tight, relentlessly character-focused story about broken people and the navigation of a nightmare. Thunderbolts completely drops the weight of a wider universe to focus on the pacing, the friction, and the actual thematic resonance, factors that this franchise has missed for a long time. Success is found through restraint. By stripping away all of the cosmic baggage that comes with the MCU, it earns the time to be intimate. It takes a roster of largely similar assassins, mercenaries and lapdogs, characters traditionally used as instruments in someone else's game, and forces them to coexist together. It causes them to confront the reality that they are all, in essence, the same discarded weapon. What makes Thunderbolts stand out for me as a definitive factor in this universe, a definitive entry in this saga, is the sheer undeniable relief of watching a film that so clearly cares more about its own runtime than its placement within some grand universe. It cares more for the Thunderbolts as opposed to a film that's coming out 3 years from now, and it feels like it's been a while since we had an MCU film that felt so separated that it could do that while still feeling in place. It succeeds plain and simple because Thunderbolts prioritizes being a genuinely great film. The usual key to success when building one of these ensemble films lies in the contrast of its components. Look at the prime example, the Avengers. You take an honourable soldier, an arrogant billionaire, a literal god, and a spy thrown in there too, and force them into a room together. The friction, and by extension the comedy and the drama, naturally writes itself because you're watching diametrically opposed worldviews collide for the same cause. That classic formula works for a reason and has sustained this studio as the main ensemble routine for well over a decade at this point. But Thunderbolts goes ahead and discards that method. It doesn't give us a team full of people with contrasting worldviews like the Avengers or even the Guardians to an extent. There is no spectrum of moral philosophies, it just gives us a room full of broken mirrors. With that, let's actually look at the roster we're working with here, because we haven't mentioned any of them yet. Yelena Belova, John Walker, Ava Starr, Alexei Shostakov, and Taskmaster. No spoilers here just yet. This is the core group, and regardless of their slightly different power sets or differing costumes, they are the exact same archetype. They are isolated, traumatized individuals who were at some point molded, manipulated, and ultimately discarded by massive power structures. These organizations took people and hammered them into instruments of violence. These characters are people who have only ever known how to take orders, neutralize targets, and suppress their own humanity in order to get shit done. So, what happens when you take a bunch of weapons, strip away their handlers, and force them to operate as a unit? You get the Thunderbolts. This is where the film's sense of humour really shines. Now, Marvel has a humour problem. This could be a whole other video on itself. Thunderbolts feels like a massive departure from that grating, quippy nature of the line delivery from so many of these films nowadays. I like that unlike most of their movies where the humour really tends to break up tension in a bad way, it doesn't really add anything, it doesn't really give any sense of relief to a scene, it's used here almost in a characteristically defensive manner. It comes naturally with that friction that you get from people that possess such little emotional intelligence, especially because they are in the middle of a situation that does require an ounce of human connection. They lack the basic socialization skills in order to work as an actual team, and watching them stumble together early on is actually endearing to watch. Yelena is someone who operates behind a wall of sarcastic detachment. She is someone who treats every interaction, every mission, like an inconvenience because actively caring about an outcome of any variety means finding the strength to care about anything at all. John Walker is sitting at the other side of that spectrum on the surface. He's desperation personified, practically begging internally for validation and the return of any form of structure, desperate to prove he's a good soldier to any level of authority willing to listen. Now, even if we were to stop with dissecting the characters here and now, you still have a neutralization of coping mechanisms with these two people alone. Yelena sees John as nothing more than a lab rat on a leash, and refuses to feed his delusion. John, on the other hand, can't handle her disrespect because it shatters the illusion of the noble mission he needs to believe will restore his honour. But then you look at Ava, someone who was weaponized at a molecular level, someone whose very bodily autonomy was stolen by her government. Or Alexei, a man who hides his crushing insecurities behind outdated Soviet glory and loud bravado. Where Alexei tries to, at times, appear paternal and caring, Ava cuts through that bullshit and recognises the discarded asset desperately trying to retain some level of relevancy. And of course there is that most established member of the group that I mentioned in Bucky Barnes. Bucky! If the rest of this team are discarded weapons who are only just beginning to realise they've been played, Bucky is the ghost of their future. He's the original victim, a man who spent decades functioning as a mind-wiped weapon of destruction. The crucial friction that Bucky brings is that he got to the other side of that ugly, agonising world of healing. He's been to countless hours of therapy and faced the red in his ledger. So him being forced into this team doesn't mean he deflects with sarcasm or desperate patriotism. He actually operates with what feels like a bone-deep exhaustion. Bucky represents this tired patience as he recognises every defence mechanism in this group, because they're likely things that he's used at some stage himself. He's the living proof that you are more than capable of surviving a system that makes you. The brilliance of the cast dynamic with Thunderbolts for me is that this is a film that could have very easily either become this slapstick buddy cop type movie, or it could have on the other end been this gritty espionage thriller. I like the balance that comes with these characters because it's able to then operate in the middle ground naturally without ever feeling like it has to commit either way. The charm of this movie comes from watching these characters interact, it comes from watching them speak with one another. It's really interesting watching this little ounce of relief start to grow within them because they realise that they're no longer having to hide that ugly, violent part of themselves in order to fit into a team, because the person to their immediate left has just as much baggage as them. This sameness is the engine that drives the movie's second act. It functions as a dark workplace comedy where the workplace is a moving target and the employees are recovering hitmen. This dynamic is brilliant and crucial in that it lays the critical groundwork for the emotional weight of the third act. The reason this specific group of people is ultimately able to recognise the tragedy happening to Bob isn't because they're noble heroes who decide to do the right thing. It's because they look at him and see their own reflections staring back at them. They recognise the exploitation in Bob's eyes. If this entire movie featured a team with contrasting natures and ideals, that thematic resonance just wouldn't exist. That radical empathy they show at the end of the film only feels earned because we've seen them awkwardly realise that they're not alone in their trauma. They spend the bulk of their runtime trying to push each other away, using both cynicism and violence, only to realise that the way out of this trap is just to let one another in. The friction of their sameness forces them to stop acting like weapons and start acting like people. Valentina Allegra de Fontaine is the catalyst for all of this. She is the reason why the third act of this movie works as well as it does. Marvel villains are typically defined by their destructive capabilities, but Val brings a different type of threat to the table. She's not a purple titan erasing half of the universe or a rogue AI dropping cities from the sky. She's middle management with absolutely zero oversight and a completely blank conscience. When we look at the Thunderbolts, we're looking at characters who have all survived people like Val, so positioning her as the orchestrator of this team acts as a confrontation with the very system that has run their lives up to this point. She doesn't view these people as human beings so much as assets, made to be deployed and disposed of whenever the margin shifts, and this is something that ties really strongly into Bob. I have never been someone who professes to have read comics in any grand depth, and I'm going to reiterate that here. But even I know that adapting Sentry is a notoriously difficult thing to do, because on the page he is essentially a god with a personality complex. Yet another place where this movie absolutely shines is how it completely bypasses many of the power scaling issues and the fear of some big CGI-riddled fight in the third act, simply by grounding Bob and his unfathomable power in some form of human vulnerability. We first meet him as someone who seems profoundly lost and unwell, clearly trapped against his will. He's anxious, antsy, and generally timid across the board while showing slivers of darkness that seem to crack through the light he otherwise radiates. Val is someone who sees this vulnerability and insecurity as something she can weaponize. Over the course of the third act, we watch as she continues to manipulate him with the same playbook that every other character has seen in some capacity. She blesses him with this false sense of purpose, isolating him from anyone who might genuinely care for his well-being, and systematically replacing the real human connection with this transactional approval. It's really insidious to watch because the movie doesn't ever present it with this corny supervillainy. It looks and feels like a toxic predatory handler grooming a vulnerable employee. The reality of this dynamic is highlighted as our characters are made to watch it happen. They're watching what feels like reruns of their own origin stories. Walker sees Val's use of duty and belonging as a leash. Yelena sees the metaphorical stripping of bodily autonomy. The escalation is where the gear shifts with the narrative, where Thunderbolts pulls off its most impressive trick, in the manifestation of the void. Historically, whenever the superhero genre has tackled this dark alter ego type character, it's always treated as some sort of external parasite or sickness, or even a completely different entity that fights for control of the host. It absolves the protagonist of most of their dark impulses and allows the hero to physically beat their demons into the ground. Thunderbolts rejects that notion, making the bold choice to frame the void as an inevitable result of Bob's unresolved trauma. The void is depression. This is Bob's isolation, his self-loathing, and psychological mutilation inflicted upon him by people like Val, metastasizing into a physical threat. Bob finally transforms in a sequence that quickly heightens in both scope and scale. The entire colour palette of the sequence desaturates, and for the first time we can probably respect a Marvel movie for being grey. Where Sentry's suit is bright and represents the stereotypical look that Val wants him to carry, the void is a suffocating mass of nothing, acting as a black hole at the centre of the frame, consuming all light and oxygen in the room because that is what unchecked trauma feels like to the person experiencing it. It's a brilliant subversion of how a comic book movie would typically get to this big final boss battle. Instead of some city-leveling weapon that our ragtag heroes need to destroy, this final battle is triggered by the severity of a bad mental health crisis finally collapsing in on itself. When you centre the conflict fully on Bob's breaking point, the movie forces our characters into a very claustrophobic corner. If the Thunderbolts are to clench their fists and attack without thinking, they are no better than the weapons that Val once saw them to be. If anything, they would be validating their status as broken tools, proving once again that they are the assassins that they were built to be. But more importantly, by attacking Bob, they attack a reflection of themselves. Every single member of this team has known what it feels like to lose control. They know the horror of being turned into a monster against their will and to be judged solely by the wreckage they leave behind. This entire movie until now has been spent deflecting pain with sharp humour, and they now find themselves faced with someone whose pain has literally grown into an existential threat to the world. This is a factor that changes almost everything about the third act. The The tension stops being about whether our heroes are capable of hitting hard enough, and becomes about whether they can break the cycle of violence that they were once birthed from. Val looks at the void and sees nothing more than a failed experiment that needs to be put down. The Thunderbolts look at him and see a guy who is hurting exactly the way they hurt once before. The thematic weight of the movie hinges on this realization. If they pull the trigger on Bob, Val wins this thing, and the machine keeps on churning out these tragedies. If they don't, they have to figure out how to do something none of them have ever been trained to do. They have to heal him. Much like a video essay script from Jordan at the movies, there's a familiar formula with a Marvel Studios production. With a Marvel movie, the third act will typically come with the changing of the colour in the sky, usually parting to reveal some sort of descending enemy, and for the next 30 minutes we are subject to brightly coloured action figures smashing each other through concrete. We've seen it countless times at this point, to the degree where it is a customary part of the superhero theatrical experience. When the continued fracturing of Bob's psyche derails and decays into the void, the film makes it seem as though it's about to do that very thing, but then it doesn't, and as abrupt as that seems, it's really the only logical way to explain it. Let's picture for a moment that this threat is being handled by the Avengers. They are going to make out some sort of battle plan, they're going to go in fists swinging, and they're going to be voided. I don't think they win. The Guardians probably shoot their way into their own little personal nightmares. I mean it when I say that I think the Thunderbolts are the only possible team in the MCU that were equipped to deal with this, because even at their lowest, they are able to rise above their pain. They acknowledge that to lead with fists is to conform to Val's idea of them once more. In short, to fight is to validate the system that destroyed them all. So they choose a different path. Starting with Yelena, for the entire runtime she has used sarcasm as her metaphorical shield. She suffers heavily with the idea of purpose, refusing to engage or let anyone in after the death of her sister. Deflection is a part of her survival mechanics, but you can't joke your way out of everything alone, and so after a film-stealing scene in which we really see the vulnerable side of Florence Pugh's performance,
Daddy, I'm so alone. I don't have anything anymore.
that sarcastic detachment vanishes and Yelena steps out into the oncoming darkness. John Walker's entire identity is defined by his darkest moment. His instinct is to neutralise a threat, but when he looks at Bob, a man so violently consumed by his own pain and anger, John makes a choice to break that cycle. One by one, they all do. They embrace the void, approaching it with a calm sincerity rather than a boisterous attack plan. The visual language of this sequence is magic. It's this desperate slog against a wind that threatens to pin them up against the wall at every given opportunity. The void is trying everything it can to repel them, manifesting their own violent insecurities, screaming at them to stay away from the core of the problem because that is exactly what severe depression does to someone. And despite everything being thrown at them, the characters don't stop. They keep pushing, they take the hits and roll with every single one of them. Both physical and emotional shrapnel from Bob's breakdown is hurled at them, and they keep pushing through despite that. Surely this has to be where that big CGI battle that we're all dreading comes. Upon finally reaching him in a scene that is, God, it's just so well done, they surround and embrace him, anchoring him to life, acknowledging all of his pain, the manipulation, and the cruelty of what he's been through. They don't offer him these false promises that everything will be fine going forward, because if any people know that trauma never goes away, it's these guys. Instead, they do the next best thing in offering him solstice and that he isn't alone anymore. I genuinely believe that the third act of Thunderbolts is a monumental one, and should be talked about a lot more from the point of what we want Marvel movies to be. The default Marvel solution is rejected in favour of human empathy. In a cinematic universe where the conflicts are almost exclusively resolved by whoever is capable of hitting the hardest, Thunderbolts suggests the idea that true heroism requires the courage to be defenseless. The anomaly hanging over New York isn't stopped by means of a missile being thrown through a black hole. It collapses because the illusion of Bob's isolation is shattered. The weight of the void shrinks back down into a terrified, exhausted individual, surrounded by a group of very messy and very broken people who refused to let him drown in the dark. The aftermath of this scene features the characters both exhausted and mentally battered, sitting in the debris of a prevented crisis. The overarching cinematic universe that we are well aware we're in is still nowhere to be found. This quiet refusal to immediately begin teasing new things before the credits have even rolled is the ultimate testament to just how confident this thing is. This movie doesn't have that need to jangle keys in front of the audience, because the real investment we've paid is well worth the journey that we've seen. That term, superhero fatigue, is a card that has dominated the cultural discourse in this genre over the last few years, particularly following the releases of Avengers Endgame, which is now a period in which Marvel has seen their most rocky phase yet. Audiences will naturally point to atrocious visual effects, the amount of mandatory streaming homework from a company that claimed its shows would never be mandatory, and disconnected plotlines that never seem to pay off or even get revisited. Typically, the studio would respond by proposing even higher stakes, now at the point where they're bringing back legacy characters for roles that are clearly fan service riddled tripe. Thunderbolts is both a triumph and a mistake, because for all it does right, it faults Marvel because everything else around it pales even more significantly as a result. The issue was never really about having to course correct the multiverse stuff. The issue lay entirely in the scale and the execution of so many of their projects. By isolating the story from the other things going on in the MCU, the movie circumvents that common complaint of exhaustion. It moves with a sleek focus, giving us a roster of outcasts and actually respects the character writing enough to let it be what dictates the pacing, the humour, and the ending. Her eventual defeat isn't handed to her in a beating, it's in allowing the characters to realise that her weapons have evolved beyond what she made them initially believe they were capable of. Her tools have become a strange, dysfunctional family, and as a result, she completely lost control of them. That transition from isolated, cynical instruments to a messy support system is exactly why this movie works as beautifully as it does. The metaphorical idea behind their team dynamic is the fundamental reason for why the pacing feels so incredibly tight. Every scene, every moment of vulnerability is actively pushing a specific emotional arc forward, and because of that, it allows the movie to be the first in a long time from the studio where the comedic moments aren't egregiously unbearable for 80% of the film. Look, I love Thunderbolts, if this video hasn't made that obvious. I believe this is the longest one I've ever made, judging off of how long I've been recording this for. I love that a Marvel movie in 2025 was able to deliver something so heartfelt and pure amidst a sea of multiversal slop that they seem so determined to continue to push. You don't need an incredible backlog of homework to understand this movie. Sure, it helps knowing the characters from their origin points maybe, but it's not like you're missing key components here. You literally need a way of watching the movie and a basic sense of human empathy. And with that, you're golden. We're in a phase where these big franchise films have become synonymous with cynical content creation. This movie is a damn miracle. It's this relentlessly focused story that prioritizes character chemistry in a way that I haven't seen from this franchise since the first Guardians movie. I remember watching the credits play after my first 3 cinema viewings of this film and I was absolutely buzzing. I was someone quickly losing energy with Marvel and saw myself checking out pretty soon. Thunderbolts completely upended that feeling because rather than my excitement feeling manufactured from some hype moment that the post-credit scene tried to supply, I just felt grateful that, yet again, plain and simple, Thunderbolts is just a really great fucking film.